and thank you for joining me here at Why the Book Wins, where I compare books with their movie adaptations. My name is Laura, and today I am joined by a very special guest. It is my mom. So, Mom, thank you for joining me at Why the Book Wins.
I'm very excited.
And we are talking about The Red Pony by John Steinbeck, which it was compiled all together, the four short stories in 1937, but the stories themselves were published at different times, which we will get into. But we're comparing it with the movie from 1949, directed by Louis Milestone. And I want to warn you right now, there will be spoilers for both the book and the movie in this episode. And it is also available as a podcast if you would rather listen to it than watch it on YouTube. But I specifically wanted my mom on for a John Steinbeck episode because she lives in the Salinas area and she has history with John Steinbeck. So do you want to tell people your connection to John Steinbeck? And you can also talk just a bit about why you love him as a writer.
Well, I live in a town where his mom was from, and down the street from where I live is the Hamilton House, which is where his parents lived. And I also volunteer at the Steinbeck House. Here's the Steinbeck House in Salinas. There's John. This is a cookbook, and it's a restaurant. If you go on Saturday, the second Saturday, they have a high tea, which is super popular. I've baked scones for their high tea. So if you go on your birthday, you'll get a free recipe packet. So check out the Steinbeck House restaurant, and right down from the Steinbeck House restaurant is the National Steinbeck Center, which is really cool. It's amazing how they've done it. And it's about him. It's about his books, and locals get 10% off. This is a little magnet I got from the National Steinbeck Center. He says, I guess there are never enough books. So you can go have lunch at the restaurant, which is the house he was born in, I should say, too. It's the John Steinbeck House. It's gorgeous. The food is good. And maybe when you stop in, I'll be working there.
And then as far as you're liking his books, because you moved to Salinas in like 2011, if I'm remembering that right. So had you liked him before that? Because I don't really remember you talking too much about him until after you had lived there. But had you read him prior to even moving to Salinas?
Not really. This is one of my favorite books that he wrote. It's The Long Valley. It's a lot of short stories.
Which, by the way, for those listening on YouTube, for my August reading wrap up, I talk about The Long Valley, and that was my favorite book of the month. So in that video, I talk about The Long Valley.
This is his nonfiction. It's a collection of short stories. A lot of them are about the Long Valley, which starts in Salinas and runs all the way down through several towns. My nonfiction favorite is this one. It's a little dated because obviously it's in the 60s. He talks about Vietnam. But this is really good. It also has a few stories about Salinas. It has a short story, which I think started him into the Grapes of Wrath. So these would be, I think, my two favorites.
Which, by the way, for those who are listening, the nonfiction book you have is America and Americans. That's the title.
Yes, but the Red Pony, I did read this a few years ago, and if you go to the restaurant and you have little children, they'll give you a coloring page of the Red Pony. So
before we get into the details of the book, I just wanted to touch on some things that I noticed about Steinbeck's writing, because both of us read East of Eden back in 2020, but it had been a few years, and so The Red Pony was my first time reading his books since then. And yeah, I'd forgotten just at how vividly he describes the scenery, and he's great at creating these like complex, nuanced characters. And the dialogue, I was also really impressed by. Like, it just felt so real and genuine. And yeah, it's just, he's great at creating these characters that feel so real and their human emotions and the complexities. And then a lot of them deal with darker subjects and maybe the darker side to human nature. And
yeah, and even the Red Pony does. And he grabbed me right away. I mean, one of his characters, it was, let me go to my notes, it was Billy Buck, is that right?
Yeah.
Billy Buck, the ranch hand. And I read it and I'm like, because he was blowing his nose. Do you remember that? And it talks about how he was blowing his nose, and I'm like, oh man, get a handkerchief. And that's on the first page. It's the first sentences, and I was like, ah.
Yeah, which to start with the first story. So the first story in this collection is called The Gift, and this one was first published in 1933, and this one is about a boy Jody who is gifted a red pony, and he names it Gabalon, and Gabalon is just his pride and joy. He wakes up early to go take care of it, and he loves showing it off to his fellow students at school. And then one day he leaves it outside because Billy Buck, who is their ranch hand, he tells him it's not going to rain anymore for the day, and he trusts Billy, so he leaves the horse out. It does end up raining, the horse ends up getting sick, and ultimately ends up dying. He finds Gabalon's dead body, and there are vultures on it, and he grabs one of the vultures, and he's like trying to kill it. And Billy Buck and his dad Carl come up on him, and Carl, the dad, he's like, the vulture didn't kill your horse, like don't take your anger out on the vulture. But Billy Buck, he's like, of course he knows the vulture didn't kill his horse, but imagine how he must feel.
And well, I think even before the vulture scene, well, maybe it's after too, he has a lot of anger. So maybe he's showing his anger to the vulture, but then that anger continues. He shows it to one of the dogs that's on the ranch. Yeah. And so he's angry, and maybe that's the only way he can express his anger is he can't say to his mom or to Billy or his dad, hey, I'm angry, because they just didn't show that kind of emotion. So he needs to get his anger out, and he's upset that Billy let him down. Yeah. Maybe he's also upset at himself.
Yeah, in this story, it seems like a big theme is Jody's first experience at realizing like the fallibility of adults, and they don't always know what they're talking about, and they can be wrong. And after this, as we see in the stories as they continue, he loses faith in Billy Buck and is no longer so trusting of him, and he's more wary. And also, I think it was in this story as well where he ends up killing a smaller bird, but then he doesn't want them to see because he's like,
yes,
like feeling self-conscious of the judgment and what others will think.
Yeah, and I wrote that down in my notes. Well, also, in the beginning, though, he smashed a green muskmelon. Remember that? Mm-hmm. And that was even before the pony died. So he's in the garden. He smashes this muskmelon, and then he realizes, gee, that was not a good thing to do. And he tries to he hides it. Yeah. So it shows kind of his emotions. He's 10. He's getting older. He's not a child anymore exactly. And it's just interesting to show the complexity of his emotions, especially anger. Anger is there.
Yeah, definitely.
Before the pony is even an issue. And the pony had a bit of an attitude, like it bit his fingers, and let's see, it bit his pants and it stomped on his feet. So the pony, Gabalon, had kind of an attitude also, which, was kind of interesting how the attitude going on.
Yeah. And also with Gabalon, so when he gets sick, I thought it was interesting, like from a historical context. I don't know how they take care of horses now, but the different things Billy Buck did to try to get the horse better, I thought was really interesting. Like they create that like hot steam bag he wears. And then at one point he has like a lump in his mouth or like around his mouth that they cut, and they think cutting that open will help.
Yeah, and it was in his throat, wasn't it?
Well, there's two different times. There's like the lump they cut, and then after that, they like cut a hole in his esophagus so that he can breathe through his throat.
The first time was to get all the pus out and all the infection. And he thought that would work, but then it didn't. Yeah, this goes back before he got sick. When they're training him, they used a piece of licorice as a bit. Do you remember that part in the book?
Oh, I guess I forgot about that part. But yeah, that's interesting.
Used a piece of licorice when they're starting to train him. We're backtracking, I'm sorry. But I thought that was interesting too.
Did you have any more thoughts about this particular short story before moving on?
Yes. I just noticed it. I thought it was cool how they talked about the pony and his ears, and how if they're back, he's angry. If they're forward, he's curious. Let's see. And also Jody's thoughts of this kind of goes with his imagination, because Jody had quite an imagination. He'd imagine that there were issues or things wrong with the pony as he was going to it.
Yeah, I thought that was interesting and also kind of relatable. Like, I feel like I've done that where you envision something bad and it's like a way to tease yourself because ultimately you're assuming everything is fine. But there's that moment of like fear and that adrenaline being like, well, what if? And like these vivid imaginations of something that could go wrong.
Of course, the what if did happen, but not anything like what he was thinking. And I also have notes about his imagination. Jody had quite an imagination. And I thought of that in regards to John Steinbeck, because if you read his books, maybe not quite so much in The Red Pony, but his other stories, especially his fiction, his imagination is just like, wow. And he's writing in the 30s. He's not writing in 2020. He's writing in the 1930s. And things were a lot different in the 1930s, you know? So Jody has somewhat of that imagination. And just one more thing I noticed too, man, Jody ate a lot. 3 eggs, 3 thick slices of bacon. And I have another note too. I wrote, John Steinbeck must have been a foodie. His mother was known to be a good cook. So I'm like, he had to be a foodie. No one else would describe food the way he does or talk about it so much. He likes to talk about biscuits. I mean, he had to be a foodie.
Yeah, and with that, like Jody walks a considerable distance to and from school. Plus, he has his like ranch chores. So yeah, living a much more active lifestyle back then.
Right. And he liked kids like when I was a kid or you were a kid. One of his chores was, of course, to get the wood in for the stove, and he would cheat and try to put the logs a different way so it looked higher than it was, and so he tried those. Let's try and do this quick so I can get out and do what I want to do. So let me just see if I have any other. I don't think I have any other notes. Oh, well, I did write about his dad.
Yeah, I definitely want to talk about him, but maybe we could save it for the end because just the way his dad acts and like all of the following stories too, I just think is really interesting.
I wrote more notes on the gift about how he behaved. So you don't want me to bring that up yet?
Sure, you can.
Okay, so he was embarrassed about giving Jody the horse. I thought that was interesting. He did have a rather stern demeanor. Let me just read this directly. It says, hated weakness and sickness, and he held a violent contempt for helplessness. I was like, whoa. But then as the story's being told, he told a story to comfort them all when things were, so he had a softer side, you just didn't see it.
Yeah.
And then at another time he says to Jody, hadn't you better come with me when things are getting intense with the pony? And Jody didn't want to, and his feelings were hurt. So I mean, he had this sterner, harsher exterior, but I think, which was kind of the times, I think.
Yeah.
So, okay.
And so moving on to the second story, which was also written in 1933. So this one, we have Jody who is looking off at the mountains and he's just fantasizing about like exploring the mountains and how exciting it must be. Then around this time, an old Hispanic man shows up named Gaetano, and he says that he was born on the land that their ranch is currently at, and that he wants to stay there until he dies, because he wants to die where he was born. And Carl's dad, like, definitely does not want him there, and he's like, you can stay the night, but then you gotta go.
But it wasn't the ranch house. It was an old adobe building that I don't even know if the adobe building was, I don't even know if it was still there.
I think it was like crumbling or something.
It was what?
Crumbling, like maybe some parts of it were still there.
Yeah, a rundown.
Yeah.
But he repeats it a long time. I was born here. I want to die here. I mean, I don't know. I should have written down how many times he said it, but it was multiple times.
Yeah. And then we have Carl, his old horse, Easter, which he has had for a long time. And the horse is very old. And the horse is around and Gaetano is there. And so Carl takes this opportunity to talk about his horse and be like, oh, like it's so useless. It's gotten so old. Like I should just kill it because what's even the point? Trying to get Gaetano to like see the connection and just trying to belittle Gaetano. And Billy Buck, he kind of chimes in and he's like, I mean, like the horse deserves to have his time of relaxing after working hard for all of his life.
And he said that multiple times. Multiple times Billy Buck did. And then are you going to bring up the quote about ham and eggs?
I don't remember a quote about ham and eggs.
So the horse Easter gets to go on the mountainside or on the hillside and relax and just enjoy life after she's worked so hard. I don't know if it was Carl or Billy Buck I think it was Carl. Oh, what if the countryside or the hillside was ham and cheese? Meaning that the older man could go just, have an easier life with the ham and cheese or ham and eggs, sorry.
But yeah, the next morning they find that the horse and Gaetano are gone. Yeah, so he had this sword which Jody had been admiring. And then a neighbor tells them, it had been given to him by his father. And a neighbor tells them that they saw Gaetano riding Easter in the mountains. And that's basically with his rapier, his sword. And that's basically how that story ends. So I was curious your thoughts on the meaning and what the purpose is to this story and what John Steinbeck is trying to say.
Well, I think it's interesting too because he's in this little room where they told him he could stay one night. He could stay one night, have dinner with them, and have breakfast. And Jody's asking him about the mountains because Jody's very curious about the mountains. They're very mysterious and like what's on the other side and what's beyond the mountains. And the old man was like, I don't know. Let me think about it. Well, I did go there once with my dad. And so I think Jody was helping him to remember the mountains. Maybe he had no thought of going on that. Well, he didn't know about the older horse. But so when Jody brought up the mountains, there's the memory about the mountains, the horse. And so I don't think he was planning what he was going to do. It just kind of happened,
Right. Yeah, and obviously he chose to take that old horse too because of their similarities in some way as the character Carl was pointing out.
I mean, John Steinbeck allows us to use our imaginations. So, he went off with his old horse and his sword. Maybe he lived in the mountains and used the sword to cut vegetation so he could, whatever maybe he didn't kill himself, but your imagination can go 100 different ways with that.
Yeah, and I kind of took it as Gaetano showing that just because he's old and just because Easter is old doesn't mean that they are useless or that they can't do anything. And so now he's going to go with Easter and live off the land and show that he's still capable of it.
Well, he did tell Carl and Ruth that he would have been able to do some things. Mm-hmm. He wasn't going to just be a freeloader, so to speak. He was, he would have been willing to help out.
Yeah, but they were like, we don't need help. So also it's interesting too because Gaetano is Hispanic, and so he had originally been on this land, the land which was eventually taken from him. And so Carl seems very defensive about that, being like, this is my land, not acknowledging the fact that it's land that was taken.
Right. And I do know, I don't know anybody in this direct area, but in Monterey County, there's an area called Lockwood, and it's out by Fort Hunter Liggett. And there are families out there that I guess you could say they've owned the land since that Mexican time, where they've gotten the deeds from, the Mexican government. So some families do go way, way back.
Yeah.
And this isn't the end of the mountains either in the story. I think it's maybe he left the story open and didn't tell us the end of it, but the mountains are also come into play later.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Did you have any more thoughts about the Great Mountains before moving on?
Let me look. Oh, I just have something about, I wrote Monterey County and the Unexplored Mountains. Just a plug for Monterey County. Monterey County is so diverse. And I mean, the culture, the people, the land, you have agriculture, you have ranches and mountains, you have the ocean and coast. It's a phenomenal place to live.
Yeah.
In Monterey County.
Yeah. And I love visiting there. So,
and just one more thing I noticed too. Okay, so I have down, Carl said, don't come here to die with strangers. I mean, don't come.
Yeah, he tells him that he should just go stay with his relatives that live nearby.
Yes, yes. But obviously he wanted to come to his birthplace. But I thought that was really strong. Don't come here to die with strangers. Well, if Carl would have opened his heart a little bit, they wouldn't have been strangers. And maybe just they were closed. They were rather closed-minded in some ways. And
I mean, especially Carl.
yeah. But so that just struck me because I wrote that down. And it's just, I mean, it's a huge statement.
Yeah. So The Promise, published in 1937. In this one, so Carl knows of a neighbor who owns a mare that is pregnant. And so he tells Jody, like, if you take care of this mare, then you can have the colt that it will eventually give birth to. And so he brings the mare back to their property and he cares for it. And horses are pregnant for a long time. I don't know how long, but he's very impatient waiting for it to just hurry and have this colt.
Was it over a year? It was, I mean, because they could go early, but then they could go quite a bit later.
Yeah. So yeah, horses are pregnant from 11 to 12 months. So it is quite a while. Anyway, he gets very impatient. He's wanting it to just hurry and happen. And he keeps bugging Billy Buck about it. And Billy just keeps telling him, like, it'll be fine. Like, don't worry about it. But eventually she gets visibly big and he's like, wow, it'll be any day now.
But Jody actually kind of forgot about it. He's kind of like, yeah, it's not going to happen. And then one day it's like, bang, it's, oh, gee.
Yeah.
I had one comment to say before. I don't remember where this was happening, but Billy Buck was talking to Jody. Do you remember? And it's about the saddle blanket. And because his father was a packer, is that right?
Yeah, a mule packer.
So and he put Billy Buck's mother died when he was an infant. But anyways, he's putting the saddle blanket on the horse, and there is a wrinkle, and it injured the horse. And I think the story about that is kind of experience really is the best teacher. He never had a wrinkle in a saddle blanket after that.
Yeah. Very true. And yeah, like we said, after the experience with Gabalon, the red pony, Jody starts to lose faith in Billy, so he just keeps pestering him about this colt, and Billy is like, it'll be fine. And Billy is like so upset at the fact that Jody doesn't trust him anymore, and it makes him second guess himself. And the colt ends up being like positioned wrong though, and so when she does go into labor, Jody is right there and he sees it, and Billy has to kill the mare, and then he gets the colt out of it, and then he gives Jody the colt. And so the experience is not a good one for Billy, for Billy too, but also not Jody, because he got what he wanted, but not in the way he wanted to get it.
At a huge cost. So did you say what happened to the mare?
What do you mean?
Well, he had to kill the mare.
Yeah. I said that.
The pony. And just, I can't remember what he took, but my impression was he took something, and I wished I could remember what it is, and hit the mare on the head. And this was the mare's name was Nellie. And when she got pregnant, it seems like the mares could either be grouchy and more angry, or they could be super lovable and nice. And she was amazingly nice and lovely, and they loved her and they took care of her. And this was a mare that was well taken care of, well loved. So it wasn't like, oh, she's angry. She was special.
Yeah. Which early on, when he's going to get the mare from like the neighbor's property, the stallion comes and chases after the mare at one point. Do you remember that part? I was wondering what the symbolism was of that.
Jody is taking the mare to the property that has the stallion, so the mare could be bred. And I think the stallion escaped, and he's just huge and black and big and just has a presence. And so I think that later worked into Jody's imagination.
Because he was hoping the colt would be a stallion.
Oh yeah, and it was a big bad stallion, and not angelic, but more demon-like.
Yeah. I think, didn't he talk about calling it demon?
Yes, yeah, and his imagination went nuts with that, too.
Yeah.
I did have one more note about the promise. Let's see if I can find it. So this was with Jody, and I can't remember what it was, but they talk about the Salinas rodeo, and I just had to say the Salinas rodeo is still going on. It's in July. They usually have I can't think of his name. Toby Keith was supposed to be there this year, but they had to cancel because of his health problems. But I went to see Brad Paisley once, and they always have a headliner. That's what I wanted to say. But yeah, the Salinas Valley Fair Salinas Rodeo, excuse me, it's still huge, still going on.
Nice. But yeah, this story, I think this one was my favorite just because, I don't know, like it was so vivid for one, and it is a story that sticks with you. And I feel like this one, it was just more intense too. Like Gabelon's death was like difficult, and him with the birds and everything. But then with this one, like it's just a great example of Jody experiencing like how messy life can be, how like painful, unpredictable. Yeah. He thought this would be like this beautiful, cool experience, but realizing like the violence within nature kind of, and when things don't go right, and when you get what you want, but not in the way you want. And yeah, I don't know. I just thought this short story was especially powerful. And Jody now this cult isn't this special, wonderful thing he wanted, because now he's always going to remember how it happened. And so it kind of taints his view of this cult.
Well, it came with a sacrifice, a huge sacrifice.
Yeah.
And Billy Buck, how often do we read, I promised him the colt. I promised him. He says that over and over again. Of course, it's called The Promise, the title. I cried when Gabelon died, the first time I read the book. And I also cried with the mare and the fold. So, and not only that, Jody has to become a mother to this pony. There is no mother, so Jody needs to become the mother, and he has to care for it even more so than he would normally.
Yeah, and before all of this, when he was preparing for the cult, I believe it was in this short story where he talks about like being more responsible because he had brought reptiles home in his lunchbox and stuff. But when he knows that he's going to have a cult, it makes him more motivated to be better behaved, and he feeds the chickens better, and he does his chores more responsibly. So it like matures him, knowing that he has this responsibility ahead of him. Yeah, so I like that aspect as well. And this also made me think of how, which we've talked about this before, because you were raised on a farm. And I think people who aren't familiar with farm life, we can kind of romanticize it and be like, oh, like you're with the animals and it must be so fun. But then realizing that nature isn't always fun, and it can be ugly, and it can be upsetting. And obviously, like the birth of a cult ends up going so wrong. And so just realizing in nature how often things can go so wrong. And having a farm isn't this like fantasy we might sometimes think it is.
Right. Yeah. Well, I think he brings that up to the darker side of the ranch when he goes by the tree. I can't remember what kind of tree it was, but it was the tree where they hung the pigs that they slaughtered from. Wasn't there a black cauldron that they would use with the butchering the pigs and the tree? And so I mean that's not going out and feeding the chickens, that's kind of, I don't, what do you call it? Yeah, it was their bread and butter. It was the meat they ate. It was how they survived.
Mm-hmm. And then any last thoughts before we move on to the last story?
No, I think that's all.
So the final story is called The Leader of the People, and this one was also written or published in 1937. And this one, the mom, her name was Ruth. So Ruth's mom, Jody's grandpa, comes to visit, and when they find out he's visiting, Carl is like, oh man, that guy, he just tells the same stories over and over again. And when he shows up, he does indeed tell the same stories about fighting Native Americans and bringing this group of people out west. And the mom, she tells her husband, she's like, that was the biggest event of his life. So yeah, he just keeps telling the same stories because he wants to relive this big moment in his life. And as the grandpa is telling the stories, when they're at the dinner, Carl is being kind of passive aggressive, but he allows the grandpa to talk. And then the next morning at breakfast, Carl is talking about how annoying the dad is the grandpa, and how like no one wants to hear these stories. He just tells them over and over again. And we see that the grandpa had overheard Carl say this. And Carl apologizes, but the grandpa, he's like, you know what? No, it's okay. Like, you're right. It's fine. And he goes out to sit on the front porch. And then he tells Jody, because Jody feels bad for him. So he goes back out there. And I wanted to share a quote from the book where the grandpa says, I tell those stories, but they're not what I want to tell. I only know how I want people to feel when I tell them. It wasn't Indians that were important, nor adventures, nor even getting out here. It was a whole bunch of people made into one big crawling beast, and I was the head. It was westering and westering. Every man wanted something for himself, but the big beast, that was all of them, wanted only westering. I was the leader, but if I hadn't been there, someone else would have been the head. The thing had to have a head. Under the little bushes and shadows were black at white noonday. When we saw the mountains at last, we cried, all of us. But it wasn't getting there that mattered. It was the movement and westering. We carried life out here and set it down the way those ants carry eggs. And I was the leader. The westering was as big as God, and the slow steps that made the movement piled up until the continent was crossed. Then we came down to the sea, and it was done. He stopped and wiped his eyes until the rims were red. That's what I should be telling instead of the stories. And so I love that part where he tells them, like, you know, it's not the actual stories necessarily, but that first line right there where he's like, I tell those stories, but like, I want them to feel what it felt like to be part of that. Like, that's what I'm trying to convey, and just what it felt like to be part of this group. And he was the leader, of course, which he was very proud of. But even he acknowledges, like, if it wasn't me, it would have been someone else. You know, it still would have continued on. And so him being part of this huge movement, and then it was all over. And then after that, he didn't know what to do with his life so much because it was all about westering. But yeah, and so then after this, Jody tells him that, you know, he likes to hear the grandpa stories. And then he offers the grandpa some lemonade, and he goes inside to make the lemonade. And his mom is like, oh, you're just offering grandpa lemonade. That way you yourself can get some lemonade. And he's like, no, I don't want any. And the mom is like, oh, like, wow. Like, she's impressed that Jody isn't being selfish. And, you know, he's maturing and growing, and he actually wants to do something for someone else, and there's no reward for him involved. And that's how the story ends. So what were some of your thoughts?
So when he's talking about the westerning, they're going over the mountains. So the mountains come back into the story again. The mountains were huge in that. And then of course they get to the ocean and it's over. But so the mountains again come back into the story. And remember, he talked about people being hungry and what they're going to eat. And the leader had to make sure that the people didn't eat the lead oxen. I mean, if they ate the lead oxen, what do they have? They have nothing. And then I had a note about the lemonade because Jody offers the grandpa lemonade at first, and at first the grandpa doesn't want it, and he says no. But then he changes his mind, which was a big deal. It was a big deal. And maybe you could relate that. So the grandpa is saying, no, I don't want any lemonade. What, you know, hopefully we can hope that Carl would be more open at somewhere in the story and could mature a little like that. Like, oh yeah, you know what? I will take that lemonade.
Be open to kindness.
Yeah, just opening. Yeah.
And also another quote, which I'll just paraphrase it, but so another part of this short story is that there's this hay pile that has become smaller and smaller, and now, like, all that's left, there's a bunch of rats in there. And so Jody is excited because he's going to get a stick and beat this haystack, and the dogs will chase the rats, and he's super excited. And he's talking about it to Billy Buck, and he's like, wow, like, those mice have no idea what's happening to them today. And Billy says, like, neither do you, or me, or any of us. And Jody is very taken aback, and he's like, wow, like, that's true.
Yeah, I wrote that down too, and I forgot that it was about the mice. The mice that have been living this high life, they're getting nice and chubby. They're, you know, and now it's reality. But I bet they don't know ... what is going to happen. And then next to that I have history. You know, we don't always know. But luckily we can look back to history at times. You know, maybe that's too, the grandfather is sharing a history.
Yeah.
And I that's great. That's great, Laura.
Did you have any other final thoughts in regards to this story in particular?
No, I think we covered it pretty good.
And before we move on to the movie, if you wanted to talk in detail about any of these characters, like the dad in particular, we said, who is like a presence, even though like Billy Buck is like more of a father figure than his own father, really. Like he idolizes Billy Buck more than his dad, whose dad is just more detached. Although we do hear early on about Billy and the dad are going into town or they're going to do something. And Jody, he's like scared of his dad, but at the same time, he like wishes he could join them. So he does look up to his dad, but he has a better relationship with Billy. And so I just thought Carl was an interesting character, and he's not very likable. He's rude to the grandpa, he's rude to Gaetano. He's not like validating Jody's feelings when he's going through these difficult situations. So, yeah, like did John Steinbeck, is that reflective of his own dad, or is that just a separate character that he created? Do you know?
Oh, that's a good question. I think he does talk more about his mom. Maybe she was more of a presence because she was in the home.
Yeah.
Dad's out working. And I think his father, Ernest, I believe, never quite felt like he achieved what he wanted to achieve. But, I mean, this is a gorgeous house.
Mm-hmm.
It was a family home. This isn't a very good picture of it, but here's another picture of it. I mean, it's a big house. It's one of the bigger houses on that street. I guess you could relate it because his mother, John's mother, was a huge present in his life, and his dad wasn't as much. But I think I'm right on this. His dad did encourage his writing.
So we can move on to the movie unless you have, I mean, we'll return back to the book at the very end, but if you have any other thoughts before moving on to the movie, did you have any final book thoughts?
I really like the book. I don't know if it's for children, maybe older children. Like I said, the first time I read it, I cried.
I think it would be good for like 10 and up. I think it would be fine.
Yeah. But maybe it's something a parent and a child could read together,
Yeah.
That would be cool. That would be cool. So.
And so moving on to the movie. So this movie is a mix of 3 of the stories. So they leave out Gaetano, that whole story with him returning, wanting to die on the land. That is left out. So they have the other 3 stories intermixed, as well as like including a storyline with the husband and wife, where the husband apparently is like a city man and he wasn't born on a ranch. And so he's struggling embracing ranch life, and he doesn't like that Jody likes ranch life so much either. And so partway through he leaves and he goes back to San Jose, and then he has a brother who has a business that's doing well, and so there's part of him that's envious and he's wanting to move back to the city. But by the end of the story, he like embraces the ranch life and all as well. But I wasn't a fan of that like side story. It wasn't in the book, but it also just felt like, why is this happening? I didn't love that they added that.
Well, I think the other thing they showed in the movie is they showed more of the husband and wife and their relationship, which the book did not show. Like they didn't kiss each other in the book, and they kind of do that in the movie. But the movie was done in 1949, so I also have down they changed Jody's name.
Yeah, which seems random. Like, why did they have to change his name?
No, it's not random. Remember now, John Steinbeck did write the screenplay for this. And his first son was born in 1944, and yeah, guess what? His name was Tom. Yeah. So they also changed father and the mother's name. The father became Fred, and the mother became Alice. But still, it was like, so Tom, is kind of a tribute to his son. And the grandfather had a huge role. I mean, the grandfather's.
He shows up in the beginning, and he's there for everything.
Right. I think the grandfather had some of Carl's attributes to him from the book. So the grandfather was a much, much bigger role. He even had a special room.
Yeah.
And in the book, he didn't have, they didn't mention a special room.
Yeah.
Well, in the movie, he was more revered, I guess. He was, although, the husband, his son-in-law, still didn't care for him.
Yeah, and it's still the same thing where he doesn't like having to sit through the stories and he's talking about him and then the guy hears, and the whole thing of him talking about like what we just quoted about him, like it's not about the stories, it's what I want people to feel, and Jody/Tom making the lemonade. That happens very early in the movie, which I thought it was a good way to end the short stories because like the message itself, but also Jody being more mature at that point than he had throughout the whole story was kind of a nice character arc, whereas this happens in the movie very early on. But it makes sense though because they have the birth of the cult be like the climax of sorts of the movie. So it makes sense they wanted to end it on that note instead.
Well, the movie also, were you going to bring up the school children? Because they were a big part in the movie.
Yeah, and they seem to like bully him more in the movie, whereas I don't really remember that in the book.
And the girl seems to be the leader of the gang.
Yeah.
I thought that was kind of funny. There's like 6 of them, and there's this girl, and she's kind of like, she's it,
Yeah.
So, did you know that Beau Bridges, was he in the movie?
Yeah, he plays one of the kids. Was he the blonde?
I didn't look this time because I was more hurried, but I'll have to go back and there he is.
Yeah, I did see that.
It was like I think he was 5. I think he was 5 in the movie.
And speaking of the acting, so we have Robert Mitchum, who we can talk about, but the person who stood out the most was Myrna Loy, but in a bad way, because I thought she was so wooden, and I was not impressed with her acting. I've seen her in other things, so I know she's a good actress. But based on this movie, I was like, man, like she didn't feel like she was into the role or something. Like she says the lines, but I was not impressed with her personally. Did you have any thoughts with her acting?
Well, yeah. What stands out are her dresses and her aprons. That's what I noticed about her. Was, there's a different color coordinated dress and apron for her. And I'd agree with you. She was, they probably could have made a better choice.
And we, of course, have Robert Mitchum playing Billy Buck. And he was in this movie before he became famous. I think, like, sometime when this movie was in post-production, he had some other movie that came out. So I guess by the time Red Pony came out, he was a big name. But at the time he was cast, it wasn't quite known. But yeah, aside from Myrna Loy, I thought the acting of everyone else was good. I did think it was interesting. The guy who plays the dad kind of looked like John Steinbeck. Maybe that was a common look, but he had, like, the mustache and sort of just had that. He kind of resembled John Steinbeck. Or maybe that was just in my mind because it was John Steinbeck's book, but that's what I thought.
Wow, see, that didn't even come to my mind. And I think you're thinking of when he was older. So yeah. But I have a picture somewhere, but I don't know what I did with it of when he was younger. Okay, because I think when you mention the actor that looked like him, this is definitely what I think of, is that. Yeah. And I had not thought of that because more often I think of this when I think of him as being older. But this I have hanging in my kitchen by my cookbooks. He's quite handsome.
Yeah, that's what I was kind of imagining. So yeah, I thought the dad kind of had that look.
That did not come to my mind.
But yeah, overall, this movie, I enjoyed it. There is, I think, like the most intense scene is when after Gabalon dies, it's the same thing where he finds the body and there's the vultures and he has like a fight with one of the birds, which that was a more intense scene that kind of took me by surprise.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. And the vultures are big. They're not small. And he was brave. He was angry. And when we're angry, our adrenaline's going. And so what he did to the vulture was no small thing. And they didn't show it quite as much in the movie. I think it was more violent in the story.
Yeah.
Where they didn't quite show that in the movie. Still though, yeah, it was a big deal. And let me see what I have. Oh, I did note the fight with the vulture was quite fantastic.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and another change too with this one is that the mare that's pregnant is this prized horse that belongs to Billy Buck. And so it's pregnant at the start of the movie, and then Tom gets his pony, and then after the pony dies, Billy Buck feels so bad, and so he tells him that he can have the horse's name is Rosie in the movie. He tells him he can have Rosie's colt, to which Jody agrees to.
Right.
So yeah, that's different, where it was Billy's like prized horse, and this colt was going to be worth a lot of money. So rather than selling it and getting money or using it, he's willing to just give it for free to Tom.
Well, and money is more brought up in the movie. The school children are impressed with money and the amount, how much the cult is worth. So that's brought up more, and it's brought up more with the school children. And I thought, did you notice how they showed the passing of time? What did you think of that?
What do you mean?
So to show the passing of time, remember he would measure the horse.
Oh, yeah.
And he'd tie a knot in. So I hung it up and it had one knot. And then to show the passing of time, they added more knots.
Yeah.
And I thought that was an interesting way to show that the months had gone by.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that was cool. And then before we talk about the very end, I didn't have too many thoughts about this movie. Ultimately, like, aside from leaving out Gaetano and the ending, which we'll get to, it was very similar to the short stories. And so I was impressed with like how many things from the book were in the movie. However, something was just like lacking. I don't know, like it had the right parts there, but yeah, and I guess that's ultimately what it is the the book, you're just like so in, not just Jodie, but the other characters as well. Whereas the movie, you feel like you're just more distanced from it. And so even though some of the dialogue is there and it has all the right parts, there was definitely just, it felt more detached and you just didn't feel as invested.
Jodie was the only one. I mean, even Billy Bob in the movie, yeah, there was just, it just wasn't there, even though John Steinbeck wrote the screenplay.
Which, yeah, and like as far as the dialogue and stuff, like I said, like it was there. And I guess maybe that shows too, someone can be great at writing novels, but that doesn't mean they're going to be great at writing a screenplay, because it is two different mediums. So maybe someone else should have written the screenplay and maybe it would have been better.
Oh, that's an interesting thought. Wow. Wow. Or maybe it was the actors, like you talked about Myrna Loy.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
I mean, when I think about Myrna Loy, I was thinking about, oh yeah, she's got the blue dress with the blue apron, and oh, now it's a rose colored, you know, and as far as her acting, I'm trying to, well, how about when she opened the lunchbox? He's walking home from school, and it's kind of cool what they talk about. He's got a couple horny toads. He turns them over. He rubs their tummy, which kind of puts them into a trance. Well, I worked with a girl who would do this with lizards, and she'd get them kind of to be on her shoulder, and they would be like this for a long time. Anyways, so the mom opens the lunchbox and sees all these creatures and is like, ah! Myrna Loy is just, you know, always.
Yeah. Yeah, and there's the part where she tells the husband he needs to come home because Gabalon is dying. And so Jodie or Tom, he like can tell like that's why the dad is here. And so then he goes and hugs his dad and the dad comforts him, which they never had a scene like that in the book. But Myrna Loy, we show her and she's supposed to be looking like, oh, like so sad and tenderhearted. But I was just, yeah, not feeling her performance at all in this movie. But yeah, they made the dad a bit more sympathetic, I guess.
Yeah.
And they also leave out the whole Gaetano story where he is like just very cold to that man. So leaving that story out made him less unlikable.
Well, and they showed, I don't even know how to explain it, just the husband and wife in their relationship, because it was, I don't know, I don't even know how to explain it in the movie, how they're...
Well, and like, I was impressed with the book because the dialogue between all of the characters felt so genuine and real. Whereas again, maybe it's on the fault of the actors where it just came across wooden and not genuine. So yeah, maybe between husband and wife, their interactions just didn't have the chemistry. Maybe it was a big problem.
Yeah, I think that's a good word for it. And the other thing too is the movie was 1949, where the book was written in the 30s. So there was a lot of change, you know.
Yeah.
There'd been a war in between. Yeah. And
which I guess we can talk about the ending, because so the ending of the movie, we have Billy Buck, he's sharpening a knife because he had a dream and he's like a little superstitious, and he had a dream that the colt was positioned wrong, so he's worried that he's gonna have to kill Rosie to get the colt, and so he's preparing for this. And Tom overhears that and he's like, I don't want the colt if it means you're gonna have to kill Rosie. And they go inside and Tom is very upset, and then they return to the barn, and while they were gone, the colt was born and he's fine and the mare is fine and everything's everything was happy and they all laugh as they look at the colt and the mare. And so initially I was like, wow, like this is so cheesy. I do not like this ending at all. But actually, Scott, my husband, pointed out that this was 1949 and World War II like was still fresh, and people probably didn't want to watch some heavy movie where a horse dies in the end, right? Right after Gabalon also dies earlier in the movie, so they probably wanted like an uplifting, happy ending, especially when there's harder things in the middle of the movie. And so having that time, that perspective in mind, I was like, you know what? I could see that. People have gone through World War II and death and so many hard things. So it makes sense that they don't want to see a movie with such a heavy ending. I still don't like the ending, but it makes sense in the context of the time.
Well, it couldn't be the same ending too, because they took the ending from the book and put it in at the beginning of the movie.
Right. So like the ending of The Promise, they had be the ending of the movie.
I've watched the movie twice. I wasn't real impressed the first time I watched it, but this time I have written in my notes, happy ending. I liked the happy ending.
You did like
time.
it?
Yeah, I didn't agree with it the first time. I was like, well, I didn't race out and go buy the movie. I wasn't really impressed with it, but there was something that touched me about the happy ending of the movie. And maybe since I was looking at it a little differently too with doing the podcast and whatnot. So even though I didn't maybe like the movie as much, I did like how they did the ending. Yeah, I liked it. So
So you like a movie with a happy ending, which I mean, I do too, but.
Yeah, well, I mean, again, in the 40s, you could have the Red Pony now, probably, as he wrote it.
Yeah.
But I think during that time, no, I don't think you could have.
Yeah.
It would have been. It was amazingly enough they had the vulture in there.
Right. Yeah, because that was an intense scene.
And just backtracking a little bit too with Gavilon, it wasn't just Billy Buck's fault. I mean,
because the horse escapes too. In the movie, Billy Buck brings the horse in, but then it escapes. Whereas in the book, he had just left it out all day long. So it was totally Billy Buck's fault. Whereas in the movie, he did bring the horse in, but then the horse escaped because Tom taught it how to escape the barn.
Right, which it did in the book. It wasn't taught to do that in the book, but in the book, the horse did go out of the barn twice when it was sick.
Yeah.
But Jody wants to put the horse outside. So, I mean, it's kind of a compilation of, it's more on Billy Buck, obviously, but it was multiple things that happened, I guess, if that makes sense. Sorry.
Yeah.
So.
And before we get to book first movie and just kind of summarize our thoughts, do you have any movie specific things you wanted to talk about?
Hey, let me see if I had a couple other things. The Pledge of Allegiance.
Oh, yeah.
The Pledge of Allegiance, the children were saying that in the schoolhouse. And did you notice who the teacher was?
The Wizard of Oz.
Yes. She had a very small role, but so their right arm would be extended towards the flag, and FDR changed it in 1942 to have our hand over our heart.
Because it was too similar to the Nazis.
Right. And I liked it. I think our hand over our heart is so much better than the salute type of thing. It also took us surprisingly 81 days for a shooting schedule. And it said it was the longest and costliest for the Republican pictures. But I didn't see, was it a popular movie? Did they make any money off it? How did it do,
Yeah.
Being that it was the longest and most costly. But I thought maybe the reason for that was you have a lot of animals involved, the dogs, the horses, the turkey, the rabbit,
Yeah.
And I was looking at the hills and trying to figure out, where did they really film this? And one of the hills, just the way the trees were, I'm like, no, sorry, this isn't the Long Valley here. So it was north of Santa Monica where they filmed it. So
also, I wonder how much Steinbeck charged to release the rights to this movie. And by 1949, he was a very well-known, popular author by that point. Plus, he wrote the script, so I wonder how much he charged. I was just going to
say, yeah, he did. He did write the screenplay. So, and I wonder if he was happy with it.
Yeah, I don't know. But so to move on to the final section, book first, movie, which one do you think wins and why? Yeah, big surprise. Which for those listening, she said the book. For those who are listening to this as podcast, but
Yeah, oh yeah, definitely the book. I mean,
honestly, it's no comparison.
no, but that's no surprise.
Yeah.
I think what I was surprised about is when I watched the movie, how much the happy ending touched me this time.
Aw.
Because I didn't feel that way before. You know, maybe
Yeah.
it's because we've been through COVID and all this other stuff in life. So maybe I needed that happy ending, you know.
So true. Yeah. Where we are in our life and in the world can definitely play a part. So,
Sure.
yeah. And I agree. The book obviously wins. Like we were talking about, the movie just felt more at a distance, whereas the book, you are just like so there and you feel like you're with these characters and you understand them so well, especially Jodie. And certain aspects were definitely relatable because they felt so real. And then it was also interesting, just like historical context, like what it was like I said, like the different methods they used to try to heal Gabalon and just life on a ranch in the 1930s, I thought was interesting.
Well, they talked more in detail about the pigs and how the pigs were put to death. That there was a lot of detail with about the pigs.
Yeah.
Specifically. And maybe you could also bring up the mice too, because the mice were living quite happily in this hay.
Mm-hmm. Which they do I don't think they do in the movie, but in the book, they compare it to like the Native Americans because he's talking to his grandpa about, getting these mice. And he's like, oh, I know it doesn't compare to when you fought the Indians or whatever. But then the grandpa says something about how, it wasn't all that different, which that was interesting, like in a political way to see Steinbeck maybe saying about how it wasn't a fair fight when we came and like took land that wasn't ours, just like it's not a fair fight between a human and his dog versus a bunch of mice. Right.
Well, yeah, he was political in his writing, and there's a story in the Long Valley where he gets pretty political, but he does it in a very clever way. So you have to think a little bit about what he's saying because he doesn't come out and say it outright. He kind of hints about it.
Which, yeah, and I think that's one of the things I love about his writing is he doesn't spell it out for you and he doesn't like spoon feed you what he's trying to say. He makes it more nuanced and you have to think about it, especially in the Long Valley, which I loved all of those short stories and they're very symbolic and they're definitely ones that make you think because he doesn't just give you the answer and he makes you work for it. And for those listening, I am currently reading The Grapes of Wrath, so a book first movie for that will be coming out shortly, probably in about a month. But yeah, so more John Steinbeck content coming soon. But yeah, did you have any other final thoughts about the Red Pony book, movie, John Steinbeck before we close out?
It would be so interesting to meet John Steinbeck and just listen to him,
Well, and we already know you think he's handsome, so.
Well, his imagination just is incredible. And well, I don't know exactly how he felt about Monterey County because as he got famous, Monterey County wasn't kind to him. He had a house or an adobe in Monterey. He only had it for a year because the area just didn't regard him well. So, but he ended up living in New York, which you are a native New Yorker. And it'd be cool to go see. He lived in Sag Harbor. It's his house by today's standards. I think you could call it humble, but he had a boat out there. And I would, I'd like to meet his parents, his siblings, and have dinner with them or something.
True.
And of course, and how can you not like this? I guess there are never enough books. You know about my books. My books aren't quite like your books, but there it is. Yeah. And there's just something about a book and how it feels, and his writing schedule too was just to end on this. he would write letters in the morning, and that was kind of like maybe his exercise before he got to work, is he'd write letters. And if you go to the Steinbeck House restaurant, there's a gallery underneath, and I should have brought it. I have one at home, but they sell journals like he would use, possibly. And there's a story, I believe it's Tortilla Flats. He was writing that when his mother was sick at the house. So they were at the house when he was writing this. For some reason, the manuscript was misplaced or lost, and so he had to rewrite it. And later they found the original, and it was almost word for word, which phenomenal.
Yeah, that's impressive. I do think it's interesting learning about different writers and their process.
Yeah, he wrote in pencil, and it had a certain type of pencil. So
yeah, and the fact that he would write letters and
yeah, he'd write letters. That was kind of his warm up, So
yeah, so this has been really interesting talking about John Steinbeck with you. Thank you for coming on the show, and I would definitely recommend to people to read The Red Pony. It's pretty short. It's like 100 pages or something, so it's definitely worth reading. And yeah, thank you all for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you're on YouTube, and if you're on listening to this as a podcast, I would love a rating and review. And thank you again to my mom for coming on my show.
Thank you. It was great.
And I will see you next time. Bye.
Bye.
And I just wanted to pop in real quick and say happy birthday to my mom, because when this goes live on September 28th, it will be her birthday. So I love you, Mom. Thank you for being on my show and talking about John Steinbeck. And also thank you for just like reigniting my love of John Steinbeck. Also, actually, she ignited it in the first place too, because the reason I read East of Eden in 2020 was because she was reading it, and I decided to read it with her. And then once again, we started reading The Red Pony and The Long Valley, and then it just got me on this John Steinbeck kick. So I've absolutely loved reading his books once again, and it is all thanks to my mom. So happy birthday, and I love you. And yeah, thanks for being on my show.